I was folded into a chair built for a 7-year-old, knees somewhere up near my ears, wedged between two other dads who looked just as ridiculous as I did, when my daughter stood up in front of her entire second-grade class and rearranged my whole life in about 4 seconds. The classroom smelled like crayons and hand sanitizer. 22 kids sat cross-legged on a rug shaped like a sun, and along the back wall, the grown-ups who'd been invited in for community circle sat wedged into chairs that hadn't been built for anyone over 4 feet tall. The assignment on the whiteboard, in handwriting so neat it looked printed, read, "Someone who makes you feel loved." Josie had been bouncing her knee since we walked in. When her name got called, she popped up like she'd been waiting her whole short life for this exact moment, marched to the front, and turned to face the room with the kind of confidence I have never once possessed. "This is my dad." She pointed at me with her whole arm, chin up, like she was presenting evidence. "His name is Owen. He drives an ambulance, and sometimes he saves people, and he makes really bad pancakes, but I still eat them." A few of the parents laughed. I lifted a hand in a small wave, already regretting every decision that had led me to sit in this chair. Then Josie turned, walked 3 steps to her left, and put her hand flat on the edge of her teacher's desk like she was about to deliver a verdict. "And this," she announced, "is the woman my dad talks about every night." The room did not laugh at that one. I watched it land in pieces, the way a plate breaks. First the silence, then the turning heads, then 22 second graders trying to figure out why the grown-ups had all gone so still. Grace Bennett stood at the side of her own classroom in a cardigan the color of wet sand, a marker still uncapped in one hand, and I watched the color come up her neck in real time. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out of it. I sat there in a chair meant for a child, my heart doing something violent against my ribs, and I did not say a word, not one. I let it hang there in the air between us, in front of 22 kids and 6 other parents, and a woman I had absolutely no right to have feelings for, and I said nothing at all, because I genuinely did not know what a person was supposed to say to that. 4 months earlier, Grace Bennett had been little more than a name at the bottom of Josie's school emails. "I'm Owen Rhodes. I work 3 shifts a week out of Station 4 with Cedar Springs Fire and EMS, and I had exactly one job that mattered more than the rest of them combined, which was getting a 7-year-old through 2nd grade without either of us falling apart." Josie's mother, Marissa, died a little over 2 years ago, after a long illness neither of us likes to describe in detail, and there is a particular kind of quiet that moves into a house after that and never fully leaves, no matter how many nightlights you buy. I am not going to pretend I had that under control. I had a system instead, which is a different thing. Every night before bed we did 3 good things, a habit a grief counselor suggested about 6 months after the funeral, when Josie stopped wanting to talk about her day at all. You take turns naming 3 good things between you, out loud, no matter how small. It sounds simple. It kept us alive some weeks. The folder started showing up in October. Fairview Elementary sent kids home with a plastic take-home folder every day. Homework on one side, notes on the other, and most nights it held nothing but a spelling list and a crumpled permission slip. Then one Tuesday there was a sticky note clipped to Josie's reading log, handwriting slanted and quick. Josie helped Tyler find his library book without being asked. She has a good heart. I read it twice, standing at the kitchen counter with the pasta water boiling over behind me. I didn't think much of it. Teachers do that. Then it kept happening. Loved how Josie explained her math to the table today. Patient as anything. Josie asked if we could learn about octopuses because they have 3 hearts, and she wanted to know if that meant they could love more. I started reading the folder before I even took my boots off. I told myself it was about Josie, which was true, and also not the whole truth, which I didn't examine too closely at the time. The first time I actually spoke to Grace Bennett in person was at pickup, the second week of November, cold enough that my breath showed. I was late, running from a shift that had gone long, and the pickup line had already cleared out, except for one small girl in a purple coat sitting on the concrete steps with her backpack in her lap, and her teacher sitting right there beside her, not on a bench, just on the cold step, so Josie wouldn't be alone. "Sorry," I said, jogging the last stretch. "Call ran long. I couldn't get to my phone." Grace stood, brushed off the back of her jeans, and looked at me with an expression that had exactly zero judgment in it, which surprised me more than it should have. "She was never worried," she said. "We talked about octopuses. Did you know they can taste with their arms?" I did not know that. Neither did I, until about 40 minutes ago. Josie was already halfway into my arms, and over the top of her head, Grace gave me a small, easy smile, the kind that doesn't ask anything of you, and said she'd see us tomorrow, and walked back inside with her hands in her coat pockets. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for a full minute before I started the engine. I could not have told you why. 17 days later, the district sent out an email with the subject line, "Budget Priorities Town Hall," and that was the night the whole shape of the year changed. I read it standing in the kitchen while Josie did homework at the table, and by the third paragraph my stomach had gone tight. Enrollment was down, the letter said. State funding had been cut, and the board would be voting in early February on a list of programs facing elimination. Near the bottom, under a heading called Enrichment and Support, was a single line. After-School Reading Circle, Grade 2, facilitated by Grace Bennett. I didn't know yet that the reading circle was the only thing standing between 11 kids and a school day with no soft place to land, Josie included. Because Josie had never told me she was in it for the extra help and not just for fun, and I hadn't asked the right question. I didn't know that Grace had built the whole program herself, on her own time, unpaid the first year. I only knew, standing in my kitchen with a phone bill in one hand and a school newsletter in the other, that there was a woman who wrote sticky notes about octopus hearts, and by early February, the board might vote to take away the one thing she'd built that mattered most to her. Two questions sat down next to each other in my head that night, and didn't leave for a long time after. Whether anything between us was even real, or just a lonely man reading too much into good handwriting, and whether, when the board finally voted, there'd be anything left of the program to save. I found out who was leading the push to cut it 3 days later, at the town hall, in a middle school gymnasium that smelled like floor wax and old basketballs. Calvin Ashford stood at the podium in a blazer that fit him a little too well and talked about hard choices and fiscal responsibility for 11 straight minutes. And somewhere around minute 6 he used the phrase supplemental and non-essential to describe a program that, as far as I could tell, was the reason at least one classroom's worth of second graders still liked coming to school. I didn't say anything that night either. I was getting good at that. What I did instead was find Grace by the coat rack afterward, arms crossed over a folder full of handouts nobody had wanted, and I asked if I could help. Not the vague kind of help, actual help. I told her I was decent with a drill, and I had Tuesdays off, and if the reading circle needed shelves or a better reading nook or someone to haul boxes, I was available. She looked at me for a second too long before she answered. "You don't have to do that. I know I don't." "If, okay," she said, and something in her shoulders came down half an inch. Tuesdays, the reading circle met in the far corner of her classroom. 6 bean bags and a rug and a lamp instead of the overhead lights, because Grace said kids read differently under warm light, and I believed her because everything she said about kids sounded like something she'd tested herself and found true. I came the following Tuesday with a folding shelf unit and stayed to help 2 kids sound out a book about a lighthouse, and afterward, once the last parent had collected the last kid, Grace made 2 cups of the terrible coffee from the teacher's lounge, and we sat on 2 of the 2 small beanbags, because every other chair in the room was built for someone half our size. "Can I ask you something?" she said, turning her paper cup in a slow circle. "Why do you actually care about this? You could have just said hi at pickup and left it there." I thought about lying or deflecting, and didn't do either, because Josie stopped being scared of school around the time your notes started showing up in her folder. "I don't know how you did that. I just know it happened." Grace looked down at her cup for a second. "I was a bad reader," she said. "Really bad. 2nd grade, same age as your daughter. And I used to fake being sick on library days because I was scared someone would ask me to read out loud. I had a teacher named Mrs. Alvarez who noticed, and instead of making a thing out of it in front of everyone, she just started keeping a chair open next to her at lunch on Wednesdays, no explanation, and we'd read together, just the 2 of us, until I stopped being scared of it." She glanced up. "So when people call this program non-essential, I have a hard time not taking it personally." I didn't say anything smart back. I don't think there was anything smart to say. I just told her that whatever the board decided, the shelf wasn't going anywhere, and she laughed, actually laughed, and for a second the whole room felt warmer than one lamp had any right to make it. My partner at the station, Des Okafor, noticed before I did, which tells you something about how much attention I was paying to myself that fall. We were restocking the rig after a slow Wednesday shift, counting gauze, and he asked, without looking up from the supply bin, how many Tuesdays in a row I'd picked up the reading circle instead of going straight home. I told him I liked being useful. He said I'd also picked up 4 extra overnight shifts that same month, on top of the Tuesdays, and asked if I'd noticed that pattern myself, or if he needed to say it out loud for me. I told him to mind his own supply count. He kept going anyway, because 11 years of riding in the same rig burns off whatever patience 2 people might have left for letting each other lie. He said Josie's teacher's name had come up in conversation more times than he could count since October, and that a man who kept his house that quiet on purpose usually had a reason, and it might be worth asking himself whether the reason still applied. I didn't have an answer for him that night. I closed the supply bin harder than I needed to, and told him to get back to work, and he let it go. But he had a look on his face the rest of the shift like he already knew exactly how this was going to end, months before I let myself believe it. That was the night I said her name to Josie for the first time in a way that wasn't just relaying a school update. We were doing 3 good things at bedtime. Josie's face half smashed into her pillow, and when it got to my turn I said, without really planning to, that Ms. Bennett had a really good laugh, and I was glad I'd gotten to hear it. Josie propped herself up on one elbow. "You always say Ms. Bennett. She's just been nice, that's all. You said her name yesterday too, and the day before that." I told her to go to sleep. She did, eventually, but not before informing me, with the flat authority only a 7-year-old can manage, that she thought Ms. Bennett was probably my favorite person who wasn't her, and I laughed it off in the dark and did not sleep especially well that night. 6 days later, my phone rang mid-sentence, which is the kind of thing that happens in this job often enough that I should be used to it and never quite am. Josie had already gone home with my sister Meg, who was keeping her overnight while I covered an on-call window for the station. Grace and I were standing outside the classroom door after the reading circle, both of us stalling in that specific way people stall when neither one wants to be the one who says goodbye first. And she'd just started telling me something about a kid in her circle who'd read his first whole chapter book that week, cover to cover, and how he'd cried a little when he finished it. And I was watching her face do the thing it did when she talked about the kids, open and unguarded in a way she wasn't anywhere else. And my phone buzzed against my hip, the station's number lighting up the screen. A second crew had called out, and they needed me in for an emergency overtime shift. I told her I had to go. She waved me off toward the truck. Go, go. But there was something under the words, some current I hadn't heard from her before, that made me want to stay exactly where I was standing, badly enough that I noticed the wanting. I didn't get to find out what she'd been about to say next. I thought about that gap the whole drive to the station. It became a habit after that, noticing the gaps, the conversation that got cut off, the sentence she started and didn't finish, the thing I almost said outside her classroom on a Thursday in mid-December, with the parking lot empty and the sky already dark at 5:30. When she mentioned she hadn't really dated anyone since a broken engagement 2 years back, said it lightly, like a fact about the weather, and I opened my mouth to say something true and then didn't, because Principal Ferris walked out the side door at that exact moment with her keys jangling and asked if we were locking up, and the moment folded itself closed like it had never happened at all. Principal Diane Ferris was the one who said the quiet part out loud. About a week after that, catching me in the front hallway with a look on her face that told me this wasn't going to be a conversation about shelving. I need to say something, and I need you to hear it the way I mean it, she said, arms crossed, not unkind. You're at this school a lot, Owen. People notice things. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with you being here. God knows Grace could use the help. I'm saying Calvin Ashford is looking for any reason to make this program look unprofessional right now. And a single parent who happens to be the father of one of her students, spending every Tuesday alone with her after hours, is exactly the kind of reason he'd love to find. I felt my face go hot. Nothing's happening. I didn't say it was. I'm telling you what it could look like to someone who wants it to look bad. I drove home that night with both hands on the wheel and my jaw tight, and I called my sister Meg from the driveway before I went inside, because I needed to say some of it out loud to somebody who wasn't going to write it down in a file. Meg picked up on the second ring, heard maybe 4 sentences, and went quiet in that particular way she does right before she says something I don't want to hear. You like her, she said. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. You're just scared of it. I sat there with the engine ticking as it cooled and told her about the notes in the folder, and the octopus hearts, and Mrs. Alvarez, and the empty chair at lunch on Wednesdays, and the way Josie had started sleeping through the night again around the time all of it started, and Meg was quiet for a long moment before she said something I didn't expect. Marissa would want you to stop doing this thing where you treat being happy like it's a betrayal. I didn't have anything to say back to that. I sat in the dark driveway a long time after we hung up. For a while after that I pulled back, and I think Grace did too, though we never said so directly. I stopped staying after the reading circle to talk. She started walking straight past me at pickup with a quick, polite smile that didn't reach the rest of her face. It was worse than the alternative, honestly, that careful distance, because it meant we both knew exactly what we were avoiding. It lasted through winter break. It ended on the reading circle's first Tuesday back in January, when the last kid had been picked up and the room had gone quiet except for the hum of the radiator, and Grace was straightening books on the shelf I'd built with her back to me, and I said her name, just her name, nothing else prepared behind it. She turned around. Neither of us said anything for a second. I want to be honest about that second, because it mattered more than most of the sentences either of us has ever said out loud. She didn't look away, and I didn't either, and the room held still around both of us, the lamp humming, the radiator ticking, and for that one long second the budget and Calvin Ashford and Principal Ferris's warning and every reasonable objection either of us could have made simply weren't in the room with us. Then Grace broke it. We shouldn't. It came out of her almost like an apology, quiet enough that I felt it more than heard it. I know. Mine came out the same way. Neither of those 2 sentences was a lie, and neither of them was the whole truth either, And we both seemed to understand that at the same time, standing there in a room that smelled like pencil shavings and radiator heat, close enough that I could have counted her eyelashes if I'd let myself. That was as far as either of us let it go that night, though I noticed neither of us moved to leave for a full minute after we'd both agreed out loud that we should stop. And I noticed she noticed it too, and neither of us said anything about that part. I want to tell you what happened at Community Circle made sense after that, and it did, in hindsight. Josie had heard Ms. Bennett's name at our dinner table and our bedtime routine more nights than not for 2 straight months. She'd watched me build a shelf and haul beanbags and volunteer for a program that had nothing to do with being a paramedic. Kids notice everything and explain none of it the way adults would. So when Grace put someone who makes you feel loved on the whiteboard and asked the class to think about who they'd choose, Josie didn't think about it very hard at all. She just told the truth as she understood it, loudly, in front of everyone, the way 7-year-olds do right before they learn that some truths are supposed to stay quiet. I sat in that tiny chair with my whole face on fire, and Grace stood by her own desk with a marker in her hand and nowhere to put her eyes, and for 3 full seconds nobody in that room said a single word. Then Principal Ferris, who I hadn't even noticed standing in the doorway, clapped her hands together once, bright and businesslike, and said, "What a lovely share, Josie, thank you," and moved the circle along to the next kid before anyone else could say anything at all. I never got the chance to correct it or confirm it, and by the time the bell rang I'd lost whatever window there might have been to say anything to Grace beyond a mumbled goodbye at the door. I told myself it would blow over. It did not blow over. By Thursday, 2 separate parents had mentioned it to me at pickup with knowing little smiles, and by Friday, Principal Ferris asked me to come in for a conversation that I understood. Walking down that hallway was not going to be a friendly one. Calvin Ashford had heard about it too, apparently from a school board member whose kid was in Josie's class, and he'd raised it at a closed session as evidence. His word, evidence, that the reading program's leadership showed what he called concerning lapses in professional boundaries. Grace was in that meeting when I walked in. She looked like she hadn't slept. "I'm not asking either of you to explain your personal lives," Principal Ferris said, hands folded on her desk, tired in a way I hadn't seen on her before. "I'm telling you that Mr. Ashford intends to bring this up at the board vote in 11 days, and I need you both to understand what that means for the program's chances." 11 days. I did the math without meaning to, the way you do when a countdown gets handed to you. 11 days until the board decided whether the reading circle survived, and now, thanks to one honest sentence from a 7-year-old, that decision had gotten tangled up with something that had nothing to do with reading levels or state funding at all. Grace didn't look at me when she spoke. "I'll withdraw from the program if that's what protects it," she said, voice steady in a way that cost her something to hold. "I built it. I can step back from running it if my being here is what's putting it at risk." "No," I said, before I'd fully decided to say it. "That's not. No. You don't get to disappear because of something my kid said in a classroom." "Owen, I mean it." The room went quiet the way rooms do, right before someone says something they can't take back. Principal Ferris looked between the two of us for a long moment, and whatever she saw there, she didn't comment on it, just told us the vote was in 11 days and asked us both to think carefully about what we wanted to say, if anything, when the floor opened for public comment. I thought about it for 11 days straight. I thought about it during calls, during the drive home, during 3 good things, when Josie's list started including, more and more, some version of "I hope Ms. Bennett's class doesn't go away," which told me she understood far more of what was happening than I'd given her credit for. On the 10th night, she looked at me very seriously across her plate of spaghetti and asked if it was her fault because of what she'd said at Community Circle, and I had to set my fork down and tell her, as plainly as I could, that nothing that had gone wrong was because of anything she'd said. Grown-ups make things complicated. Kids just say what's true. The board meeting was held in the same gymnasium as the town hall. Folding chairs set up in rows under a dark scoreboard, and by 7 o'clock every seat was full. Parents standing along the back wall, Josie sitting in the front row between me and Meg, who'd driven 40 minutes to be there because she said she wasn't missing this for anything. Calvin Ashford opened the floor with a summary of the budget shortfall, professional, measured, and then, almost as an aside, mentioned that the board had also received concerns about, his phrase, appropriate boundaries within the after-school programming, which was as close as he came to saying it out loud in public. And it landed anyway, a ripple of murmurs moving through the rows behind me. Grace sat 3 seats down the row, spine straight, hands folded so tightly in her lap the knuckles had gone pale. When the floor opened for public comment, 11 parents spoke about the reading circle before I did, one after another, describing kids who hated reading in September and asked for books by name in December. One father, a big guy in a work jacket I recognized from the pickup line, got about halfway through a sentence about his son's reading scores before his voice gave out on him entirely. He just stood there at the microphone a second, shook his head, said sorry, and finished by saying his son used to cry about homework most nights, and now the only crying happened when a book ended and he had to wait for the next one. That was the whole speech. It was enough. The gym went quiet in a different way than it had for Calvin Ashford's numbers, and I watched the board members' faces and could not tell if any of it was landing the way it needed to. Then Carol Simmons, the PTA president, stood up and said flatly that she'd rather cut the football program's new uniform budget than lose a program that had gotten her own son reading above grade level for the first time in his life. And half the gym applauded, and Calvin Ashford's jaw went tight in a way that told me the applause had cost him something. I stood up when the microphone came around to my row. I want to tell you I had a speech prepared. I didn't. I had 11 days of thinking and no actual sentences, and I walked up to that microphone with my hands not quite steady and looked out at a gym full of people, half of whom now knew, or thought they knew, exactly why I was standing there. My name's Owen Rhodes, I said. Most of you know me as Josie's dad. Some of you probably know me as the guy from Community Circle. A little laugh moved through the room, not unkind. I'm not going to stand here and pretend that what my daughter said that day didn't happen, because it happened, and it was true when she said it, and it's still true now. So there's no point in either of us pretending otherwise. I found Grace's eyes across the gym. She had gone very still. I've spent 4 months watching a woman build something out of nothing, on her own time, for kids who needed somewhere soft to land, my daughter included. And I've spent 4 months being too careful, too cautious, too worried about what it would look like to just say the true thing when it mattered. My daughter had more courage at 7 than I've had this whole year. So I'm not going to make that mistake again tonight. This program matters. It matters because of what it's done for my kid. And it matters because of the person who built it. And if this board votes to end it because of budget lines, that's one conversation. But if any part of this vote is about punishing her for something she never even did, then you're not just voting on a line item. You're voting on whether the people in this town who do the most good get the most scrutiny for it. I don't remember sitting back down. I remember Josie grabbing my hand hard enough to hurt, and Meg's face doing something complicated, and Grace not looking away from me even once, even as her eyes went bright and wet under the gym lights. The board voted after 20 minutes of public discussion. 5 members, and the first count came back 2 in favor of keeping the program, 2 against, 1 abstaining, and for about 4 seconds the whole gym held its breath waiting for a tiebreak that legally couldn't happen, which meant the program would default to the cut list unless someone changed their vote before the meeting closed. Calvin Ashford asked for the floor one more time. I watched Grace's hand find the edge of her chair and hold on. "I want to revise my vote," he said, and the gym went dead silent. My daughter had a Mrs. Alvarez too, 20 years ago, a teacher who kept her after school twice a week for a whole year without ever once mentioning it to me, because she didn't need my gratitude. She just needed my daughter to read. I forgot that until tonight. I'm changing my vote to keep the program funded. The gym made a sound I can only describe as a held breath finally let go. Applause, and a few people openly crying, and Carol Simmons hugging a stranger 3 seats down, and Josie was up out of her chair and running for the aisle before I could stop her. And I watched her wrap both arms around Grace's waist in front of the entire gymnasium, and Grace knelt down and hugged her back with her eyes shut. And when she opened them again, she was looking straight at me over my daughter's shoulder. And neither of us said anything, because for once there wasn't anything that needed saying out loud in front of a crowd. We ended up in the school parking lot 40 minutes later, after the folding chairs had been stacked and the gym lights shut off. Josie finally fell asleep, buckled into the back seat of my truck, the heater running low. And Grace stood next to me under a streetlight with her coat collar turned up against the cold, and this time neither of us reached for a reason to stop. I meant what I said in there. I know. She tucked a strand of hair back from her face, unhurried about it. I've known for a while, actually. I just didn't think you did. I think I've known since the octopus hearts. She laughed, and it fogged in the cold air between us. And then she wasn't laughing anymore. She was just looking at me, close enough that I could see her breath catch, and I asked her, quietly, if it would be all right, and she said yes before I'd even finished the sentence, and there wasn't anything complicated about the kiss that followed. No bored vote hanging over it, no folder note, no careful distance. Just 2 people who had spent 4 months being far more cautious than either of them needed to be. Finally done waiting. It's been 8 months since that gym went quiet and then loud again. 8 months of Tuesdays that don't get interrupted anymore. A reading circle that outgrew its 6 beanbags so fast Grace had to bring in 4 more, and one afternoon in March when Calvin Ashford showed up to the winter reading fair, stayed 45 minutes, and left without anyone making a thing of it, which felt like exactly the right way to let a person change. Last Tuesday night, after the extra beanbags had been dragged home for cleaning, and the shelf I built last winter had been restocked twice over, Josie somewhere around chapter book number 11 these days, and still announcing it to anyone who holds still long enough to hear, the 3 of us sat on the living room floor at my place, lamp on instead of the overhead light, because Grace still swears kids think differently under warm light, and I've stopped arguing with her about it. Josie between us in her pajamas, working through 3 good things before bed, the way we have for nearly 2 years now. A habit that outlasted grief and outlasted caution both. Josie went first, something about a kid in her class finally finishing his lighthouse book. I went second, something small about the shift I'd worked that day. Then it was Grace's turn, and she thought about it for a second, the way she always does, like the answer actually matters to her, and she looked at Josie and then at me and said the 3rd good thing was that she got to be in this exact room, on this exact night, with the 2 people who'd taught her that some truths are better said out loud than kept careful and quiet. And Josie, half asleep already, mumbled that she'd known that the whole time and reached over without opening her eyes to take both of our hands at once, one in each of hers, and held on until she fell asleep right there between us on the floor.